Okay. I am Paul Vixie, founder of Internet Systems Consortium. If you're running Bind, you got it from us. That's my introduction. I do not have an hour and 15 minutes of material for you today. So given it's the last session on the second day, I think we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So DNSSEC, secure DNS. Let me give you a little bit of background about that won't be in the slides. At the moment, DNS is so hideously insecure that you really don't need to send very many packets to have a successful man-in-the-middle attack on any DNS transaction that you might choose. And this results in a couple of costly downstream effects. One is that protocols that initiate their sessions using a DNS transaction have to do their own security. A traditional example of that would be something like HTTPS, where you are exchanging these X509 certificates, and one of the fields in that certificate is the name of the host. And so ideally, after you do your DNS transaction, after you make your TCP session, you're talking to the remote end, they can prove to you that they really are who you thought you were connecting to. Quite a few protocols could benefit from that sort of authenticity, but they're not willing to do the extra work of sort of SSLing the whole thing. X509 is difficult to get going with. You have to buy your cert from someone who has gotten themselves into browsers, that kind of thing. So there are a lot of protocols that need this that don't have it. The ones that need it enough that they were willing to do the work were sort of expensive to deploy and are still expensive to maintain. But to me, the most pressing issue is that with insecure DNS, there's quite a bit of data that we might like to put in the DNS that we won't put there because there's no authenticity. Some things, you may have heard of Yahoo domain keys. It's an anti-spam thing that's hit the papers in recent months. They include their own information so that you can tell by what you got back whether it really belongs to the person who owns that domain. But that requires a little bit of extra work, and it's not a given to me that every client who looks up a domain key will do the work of validating them. That means that potentially a spammer who would like to evade the protective effect of domain keys needs only to launch a trivial man-in-the-middle attack against the DNS transaction that your mail server is going to do. This is also a big problem with SPF, another DNS-based spam protective measure. So I am a fan of DNSSEC, so-called secure DNS. The current DNSSEC specification is the second one that the IETF has declared ready to deploy, therefore we call it DNSSEC-bis. The next one that IETF declares ready to deploy would be called DNS-TER and so forth. We're using sort of ISO terminology since so many current IETF people come from the OSI community of decades past. There are problems, and I'm going to describe some of those problems today. Because even though it sounds like, okay, we spent 11 years at it and we have a deployable protocol, now we can fix all those problems and put lots more data into the DNS and we'll have authenticity and so forth, it's actually nowhere near that simple. So, at the risk of boring some of you, although you're evidently hardcore DNS weenies or you wouldn't be here, I'm I'm going to explain a little bit about how the DNS delegation model works. Some of you already know. Some of you probably don't want to know, but I have to explain a little bit of this in order for you to grasp where the rest of the hooks in this technology are sinking in. I'm going to explain the technology and some of its implications. As some of you recall, there was once a file called hosts.txt. It was sitting out on Net 10 back before Net 10 was a private network. And the way that the hosts on the internet, who numbered at that time in the sort of 1 to 10,000 range, used to get their names, their name to address translations, was to FTP that file from the SRI NIC every night. And if you were a TOPS 20 system, you could consume it directly. It was in a format that your local libraries could understand. If you were a Unix host, you had to run a ugly little C program that would generate your etc hosts file. And the way it worked was there were so few hosts on the internet, it was practical to list them all. And it was also practical for every one of them to FTP this file every night. Clearly, this was not going to scale, and in 1987, they completed a multi-year effort to create something called the domain name system, which is what you all know and use today. Authenticity was not a consideration any more than admission control or source address verification or anything else that we wish we had was a consideration in 1987. On that network at that time, you had to be a member of the old boys establishment to be on the network at all. There were no untrusted parties. I'm not sure what they thought they were going to accomplish by building a network that was supposed to survive in a nuclear war, but did not have untrusted parties on it so that all the applications could be terribly weak. I mean, they used Telnet and typed passwords in the clear because the paths were trusted. So they didn't think authenticity would be a problem. After all, who would put deliberately misleading data into the DNS and who would try to interfere with someone else's DNS transactions? We're all friends here. We all have military subcontracts through DARPA or something like that. In 1994, the internet had gotten big enough and was being commercialized, privatized, and so forth that it was reasonable to consider some security implications. And 11 years later, we have produced 3 major designs of secure DNS, 2 of which got far enough to get sort of names given to them, DNSSEC and DNSSEC-bis. It's to get a sense of how long 11 years is in the lifetime of the internet, you should consider that IPv6 was begun later and finished sooner. That indicates that we did not understand the problem. It was something like 7 or 8 years into the process that someone finally wrote a requirements document. Many things which were taken off the table because they would make the process take too long came back later. It turned out, gee, we really do need that after all. It was a very undisciplined process. And the protocol we have today, which has been approved by the IESG, the steering group, that's more or less the titular head of the Internet Engineering Task Force, is really not deployable. It depends on miracles. And as you know, if you make a design that depends on miracles, you're probably going to be going back to the whiteboard and coming up with another one, which is kind of what they're trying to do. But I want to avoid that because, in my opinion, 11 years is much better than 22 years. So to avoid the need for miracles, I came up with a fairly ugly hack, which I call DLV. But first, let me tell you about domain names. Every domain name is inside of a zone. So you might have a zone like the com zone, and you might have a zone like blackhat.com. And one zone is inside of the other. And that's why when you hear the term domain name system, that a mathematician chose that name. These are domains in the mathematical sense. And it's not necessary that every dot in a domain name that you see on your screen represents a zone transition. At my house, there are plenty of machines that are called something or other .home.vix.com, but home is not a domain. In fact, something.home is just a name inside of the vix.com domain. But most of the time, if you see a dot, you know that there's a zone cut there, or a zone transition. Every zone except the root has a parent zone, right? The vix.com's parent is com, as is blackhat.com. Com's parent, or net's parent, or org's parent is the root. It is the null string. It is the empty name, and that is the root zone. And control of the root zone really is at the heart of most of the political battles that you would read about at ICANN or ITU or anywhere else. There's a worldwide food fight going on right now to see who will be in control of that. So the zones contain nodes, and every node has some resource record sets. So for example, if you have an MX record, or maybe two MX records because you have two mail servers at blackhat.com, then all of the MX records that are at blackhat.com are seen together by DNS as a set. And it's an atomic, indivisible set of records denoted by the name and the type. If you also have some A records, that is a different RR set. And if you only have one thing in the set, then because mathematicians were involved in the design, that also is a set. In order to introduce a zone, we're almost through with the boring parts, I promise you. In order to introduce a child zone, you put some NS records into your zone, which the child will then mirror at the top of their zone. And the existence of those will cause delegation, referral, all sorts of interesting things happen at the protocol level when NS records are present. We can call that a zone cut, delegation point. You know, the literature is full of different ways of naming that, but it all amounts to an NS record set. A server need not be authoritative. Most of us have a caching recursive forwarding name server. For example, the DHCP servers on this network will hand out a list of those when you connect to them. And you can send any query you want, which is what happens when you use your browser, and they will go through the difficult task of finding what you asked for. Hopefully they'll have a copy already, and you don't have to leave the local net. If they don't have it, they'll go find it. It's also possible that a server will be configured to be authoritative for some zone. That means it has all the data for that zone, including the delegation data. And if you ask it a question that it's authoritative for, then once again, you will not leave the current LAN. That's usually a performance boon when that happens. When you're going about the task of either tracing down some name because you have been asked to recurse, or if you're a caching server, you will encounter some different kinds of responses from the authority servers whose doors you knock on. You might get a negative answer telling you that the name you're asking about does not exist and you can give up now. You could be told the name that you gave me is good, but there are no records of the type you're asking about. If you're asking for an MX record and there are only A records at a given node, that's what you would get. You could be given the positive answer. I guess that you could see that as the best possible outcome. Yeah, here's what you were looking for. Most interesting in the case of DNSSEC, you could be told, I don't have what you want. That's somewhere below me. Here are the NS records that will tell you the names of the servers that have what you're looking for, or at least will get you closer to what you're looking for than I was able to do. Now, I operate a root name server. The f.rootservers.net is in more or less our computer room. And we answer around 10,000 queries a second, every second of every minute of every hour. And most of what we send is either negative, telling people that .workgroup does not exist, or it is a referral, telling them they should really be talking to the servers for COM to get what they're looking for. So the caching forwarders I spoke of earlier, the ones you would have received from your DHCP server when you got your lease, are, they have to know the addresses of the root name servers. In other words, they have to have some server of last resort. If they don't know, if they don't have what you're looking for and they haven't got any kind of an NS record in their cache that tells them about COM or tells them about something that'll get them closer to where your query is, they have to be able to go to the root. That's why we receive so many queries for .workgroup, one assumes, is that our name server address is configured by hand, cut and paste, FTP, pick your poison, into all of the caching forwarders on the internet. There are 13 of them. There's a lot of pressure to have more, but there are various protocol limitations. So if you wanted to start one of your own, I'm sorry, there are no slots for you. But it's important to realize that there's this huge installed base of caching forwarding servers that are configured at the time they're first installed and then abandoned. As you know, people move on to other jobs or the system is forgotten about. So this tends to work out okay as long as at least one of the addresses that they were pre-configured with is still valid. And we know by monitoring some old addresses that a number of root name servers that haven't really existed for 15 years are still being contacted thousands of times a second. But that's okay, at least. You know, the internet does not fail because of that. It makes it impossible to reuse that address for something else, and maybe it costs you a little bit of bandwidth, but that's all. Sorry about the screensaver. DNSSEC adds some new types to the system. I'll describe those briefly. There's a DNS key, and you make that. So when it's time for blackhat.com to secure itself, it will get a, I'm sure, high-quality random number generator and make a long string of bits and cut it in half, and there will be a private key and a public key. And the private one, as I'm sure this audience is well aware, is used for signing data. The public one is used for verifying it. It's important to keep the private one private so that other people cannot impersonate you by signing their data with your key. It's important to make the public one public so that other people can, in fact, validate the data that you have signed. The public key goes into a DNS key resource record at the top of your zone. But that by itself doesn't help much because anyone else could, load a zone just like yours and put their own DNS key at the top of it and, sign that version of your zone with their key. So putting the DNS key into the zone that's being signed is only part of the solution. I'll come back to that. The RRSIG is made for every resource record set in your zone. If you have an MX and an A record at some name, you will see an RRSIG for the MX and another RRSIG for the A. You might be able to imagine that it takes more memory to load a zone that has DNS security information in it than one that does not. Most of us don't care about that because our zones are small. I'm sure blackhat.com only has a few hundred entries. For somebody like VeriSign with .com, with 50 million entries, it could be sort of a major endeavor to figure out how they're going to triple their memory footprint, especially if they're already at some hardware limit, like, gee, that's as many gig as I can stick into that backplane. The NSEC record was the catch-all. This is the other column on the spreadsheet. This is where everything went that no one in the design team could figure out another place to put. It describes the spans of your zone's namespace that have nothing in them, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but it turns out when you want to send a negative response, a secure negative response, you have to prove that the name they're asking about doesn't exist. Otherwise, it would be a man-in-the-middle opportunity. Someone else could launch a denial of service against you by causing people who ask questions of you to believe that let's say blackhat.com does not exist. So we need to be able to sign those negative answers. But it's impossible to pre-generate signatures for every possible negative answer. There's no way to know what question someone will ask that will have no good answer. If we tried to do online signing and generate those signatures at line speed, at line rate, then it would be trivial to launch a CPU denial of service attack against your name server. They can ask a slow trickle of questions that have negative answers and watch you spend all the CPU time you have generating signatures for each negative answer you're trying to make. So we have to pre-compute negative answers, and the way that we came up with to do this is to pre-compute the spans of non-existence. And if your query falls into one of those spans, you will get back one of these NSEC records that says, here is my signed proof that nothing from here to there exists. Your query is between here and there, therefore you should be satisfied. NSEC is also used to give a list of the types that are present at a node, so that if you're giving someone an empty answer, for which there would again be no signatures, since there's no RR sets in the answer for signatures to attach to, you would send them the NSEC record that says, here's proof of the list of types that does exist at the name you've asked. You should be satisfied that the type you asked is not on that list. Question?
What prevents an attacker from retrieving, so let's say you have a legitimate entry inside a particular span. What prevents the attacker from grabbing a name that's slightly out, that's illegitimate but still in the same span, collecting the NSEC for that span, and then spoofing a DNS, a lookup? So when someone goes ahead and looks up the name that does exist, they reply with the NSEC for its span neighbor that doesn't. In other words, what prevents the attacker from going to the server, collecting an NSEC, and then spoofing that back out for zones that do exist?
The only signed spans that will exist, and the question for the audio is there a way to ask for some borderline name and to have a man in the middle use some replay attack in order to cause the questioner to go away thinking that a name doesn't exist that actually does? And the answer is no. The span has two, the NSEC record describes a span from the owner of the NSEC, which is purported to exist, to some other name which is purported to not exist. Normally, NSEC records are useful as a chain. You could actually walk the entire NSEC chain and get a list of all the existing names in someone's zone. But in any case, any non-existent name really won't fall inside of a signed NSEC. Excuse me, any existing name won't fall within that span. So there's no way to do a replay attack.
Isn't that a way to do a kind of a stealth zone transfer then?
Yes, we call that the zone walking problem, and it's one of two of the big problems that is causing the IETF to wonder if this stuff is really done or if maybe another 11 years would help. The DS record is how you tie your public key to the rest of the system. As you know, you have to have a certification chain from something you trust to something that you're trying to verify. And the way that we do that is after you make your public key and put it into your DNS key record at the top of your zone, you then take a hash of that, which we think is a pretty secure hash, you give it to your registrar. So blackhat.com, after they make their key, has to go to, I don't know who they use, clown.org, whoever it is, and say, gee, could you get the VeriSign people to put this DS record into the comm zone at the Black Hat name? And ultimately, that creates a certification chain that goes all the way back to the root. And the root public key has to be pre-configured with cut and paste, FTP, pick your poison, into every validator, which is to say every recursive name server on the internet. What we've learned from pre-configuring the root server addresses is that those files will not be revisited. Even if they stop working, people are more likely to add more name servers than to try to discover what name servers they have and to fix the ones they have. That means that the public key for the root, it can be printed on T-shirts and sold at IETF meetings. It can be, we can put it on billboards. We can find all sorts of ways to give it to people because there's really only going to be one in the lifetime of the internet for all practical purposes. You could make 3 or you could make some number on day 1, but you can't roll it every year as you might prefer to do. That sort of in-band revocation and rollover was taken off the table in year 4 of the 11, and it's being reintroduced now, which is the second of the 2 reasons why the IETF is wondering if it really is ready to deploy or not. Gee, all the things that we took out in order to get this thing out the door quickly still didn't cause it to get out the door quickly, and it turned out we needed them after all, so it's sort of a double whammy. So invalidation, a positive, I described this, I'm not going to go through it again. Now the root zone, I told you there's a food fight that goes on in the halls of power around who owns the root zone. Plenty of people would like to add their name to the root zone. So that instead of, let's say, www.blackhat.com, you might be able to look up www.blackhat. Wouldn't that be cool? Problem is the root zone looks pretty good, small, and I don't know if it would look as good if it had 50 million things in it, vanity domains. It's just, that doesn't strike me as a good approach. And so, and other people agree that having this thing be elastic in size would not be good for the community. But they each have a different idea of sort of how much we should add and on what basis before we say no more. It's a little bit like people moving into a cutesy little town because they love it and saying, well, it would be perfect if only I could knock down this house and build a castle here instead. So pretty much what you have is the ITU, and that's where country codes come from in your dial plan. We are country code 1 because the telephone was invented here. Then you have ICANN, which was formed kind of out of the ashes of the old IANA when John Postel died there in Marina del Rey. And you have the US Department of Commerce, and no one's quite clear on how they came into the picture except that they issued an operations contract to the IANA and thus claimed that they controlled, that they were the selector of who was the IANA and what the IANA's policies would be. And it turned out that the IANA had existed a long time before that contract. And so it's hard to trace that and say, yes, there's a line of succession here, but in any case, the U.S. Department of Commerce has insinuated itself into the process. VeriSign, the owners, more or less, of .com, have a role to play. They currently edit this zone. So right now, if some country code administrator, out in the Tokelau Islands, they want to change the list of NS records for .tk, they send their request about that to ICANN. And ICANN looks at that and says, well, technically there's nothing wrong with it, but we don't really have a good policy for who is the right person inside the Tokelau Islands to be making that request. We rely on the Department of Commerce to tell us who is the recognized government of the Tokelau Islands. So they ask the DOC, and the DOC says, yeah, that's them, go ahead and make the change. So they make the change, which means that they ask VeriSign to make the change, who then asks the Department of Commerce, is this really okay? And if the Department of Commerce answers yes a second time, then the change is actually made by VeriSign to a zone. So ICANN, although they like to paint themselves as being sort of in an important role here controlling the root zone, is in fact a sock puppet. ICANN has sued VeriSign over such things as the wildcard in .com, which went by the name SiteFinder. VeriSign has sued ICANN both over that and other things like the domain waitlisting service and other types of internet governance that whenever ICANN tries to practice internet governance, VeriSign sues them and says that that's restraint of trade. The Department of Commerce is, I guess, pretty happy, all in all, that they have sort of these two different contractors that don't trust each other. That means that they don't have to worry about that somehow VeriSign and ICANN will team up and start working together directly. So that means that DOC gets to keep its middleman role just by making sure that its subcontractors do not trust each other. So the problem that's posed by all of this is, all right, we'd like to generate our root key. And I mentioned there's a private and a public part of it. And I mentioned that the public part we can pretty much print on t-shirts and hand out at this conference, and you can take it home and type in all that hexadecimal. The private part is a problem, because if you have the private part of the root key, then you are the owner of the root zone, because people will trust the data you sign, no matter where they get it from. You are king. You can say, I don't like the current root name servers, and I don't like the DOC, and I don't like ICANN, and I don't like ITU. I'm going to add .black hat because they paid me lots of money. All right, so holding that private key is a king-making role in a way that there's no current person in that role. Right now we have 3 mutually distrustful parties, and they seem to like it that way. And in order to create and deploy a root key for, or a public-private key pair for the root zone, those people are going to have to learn to trust each other. Historically, we have learned not to expect that situation to improve. If they learn to trust each other, then they have to come up with new contracts, then they have to come up with review policies to make sure no one does anything wrong with all the new data that's going to be schlepped around. I have a bet going with someone who's interior to the process of trying to get that done. He says that he can get it done by the end of this calendar year, and I have given him 10-to-1 odds and let him name his own bet. I could have said 2006 and given him 20-to-1 odds. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So you can imagine where this leads. We have technology that works in a lab, because in a lab you control the root servers and you control all the servers, and this stuff works just fine there. But if blackhat.com would like to generate a key pair and hand the hash of their public key to the .com administrator, assuming their registrar even has a way to get it from them and ever has a way to give it to VeriSign, and that's just technical, that's easy compared to the rest of this, the fact is the com zone is not signed. And let's imagine VeriSign says, well, you know, we think DNSSEC is important. We're going to triple our memory capacity on 14 servers for .com all over the world. And we'll do all of this even though there's no new revenue that will pay for any of it, and there's no clear model as to how much to charge blackhat.com for this service, right? We get $6 a domain for just having the domain at all. Don't know if we can charge an additional $6 for DS records, or if we charge nothing, or if we charge $60 to cover the fact that they don't need an X509 key anymore once they do that. Okay, there's no compelling revenue reason for VeriSign to ever deploy secure DNS. But let's assume they did. The fact that the root zone is not signed means that this game has not even started. You know, I'd love to be able to say, I'm sorry, it's game over, but it's game not started. Now, I don't like delay, especially if there's no clear indication of what I could do to speed things up. And this is not just pushing on a rope, this is pushing on, 10 different ropes at the same time. So we have an alternative to sticking with the current unsecure system. It's called DLV, and it is an ugly hack, and I shall describe it to you now. In the IETF specification that talks about validator behavior, it says things like, well, if you don't get a DS record, go search for it, or if you get it and the signature doesn't match, then signal an error. It talks about what to do, right? It's the usual sort of protocol spec, and it's a pretty good one as such things go. One of the things that it says is if you're about to give up because you couldn't find the key information you needed, or the signature didn't validate, or whatever, you're about to signal an error, you can do something called local policy. You can do something else. And it doesn't have to be part of the standard. You can just, maybe you've got a bunch of keys out on a RAID store somewhere, and you'll go look it up there. Maybe you're exchanging these things on a big email list, and you can look it up there. They didn't say what they meant by local policy. So we do that. DLV is an instance of local policy, not so much a violation of the specification as it is the use of a very good loophole. This only affects results that would have been unsecure, so it in no way impedes the deployment of real DNSSEC. Once real DNSSEC starts working, then you just won't be trying to do DLV anymore, at least for the parts of the tree that it works in. This is intended as an early deployment aid only. It has an Easter egg built into the design where it will simply cease to function a long time before it reaches the size of the internet. This was deliberate. We could have designed it as a workable alternative to the normal chain of trust, and we deliberately crippled it.
Why did you do that?
Why did I do that?
I mean, if you believe that DNSSEC will never get off the ground, why cripple the alternative?
I believe that if there were a market for it, if, let's say, Department of Commerce thought that this DLV thing was going to steal power from them and make it impossible for them to, remain as an intermediary, or if VeriSign saw that a lot of their .com domain holders were able to get work done without VeriSign's help, I believe that that will light a fire under some people. On the other hand, if we develop something that is a workable alternative to what the IETF has done, rather than just an early deployment aid, a lot of people will sort of turn themselves into antibodies. They will say, oh, you're end running the standards process, you're trying to take over the internet, you're trying to do bad things. And I wanted it very clear that this is only intended to be the good part of this, and that there's no way to build an empire on top of this. So it means that domain owners and validator operators will have a way to get keying information to each other without having to go through the delegation chain, because there are holes in the delegation chain, like at the root zone, for example, in every TLD. Right now, the small set of people who are testing this have all exchanged keys by email, and they've cut them and pasted them into their named.conf files. I don't think that scales particularly well, even with the 20 or so companies that I'm doing it with now. And I'm not sure that starting a mailing list or using RSS for it is the right answer either. You know, we'd like this to work up to 1 million, 2 million domains. And I think it's perfectly practical for it to do that, and that once that happens, there will be a compelling reason for these people to straighten up and figure out how to sign the root and sign.com and .net and all the others. And by the way, .se and .nl are signed now, but they don't have anything to do with their key data. .mil will be signed soon, and they don't have anything to do with their key data. I think that this represents proof of irresponsibility by the IETF. Yes, a question?
Why not, I mean, just put the keying material in a text record for a given domain? Instead of having to use email, it's in a text record, we use the SSH key model, which is the first time you access something, you say, hey, by the way, do you have any key material?
SSH keys are self-signed. This stuff is not. This stuff thinks that there's accompanying metadata that will sign it. So we do use the DNS for key information, and I'll explain. There's a new resource record. We call it the DLV record. Structurally, it is identical to a DS record. So that means if you have enough information to make a DS record in the parent zone, then you also have enough information to make a DLV record and send it to us. The type code number is not assigned by IANA or any other part of the IETF. It's out of what we call experimental type code space. That's where Microsoft does all of its work in order to avoid the IETF Progress Prevention Society, so I thought I would follow their lead. The DLV namespace is part of the normal namespace. And we use DNSSEC-bis to secure it. That means instead of importing the non-existent public key for the root domain into your named.conf, you have to import a trust anchor that will help you trust this, I guess you'd call it a metazone. It's not a metazone. It's trust this namespace. Certainly, if we had 1 million names, we'd expect most of them to be in .com, and we would want to split the com portion of this namespace into its own zone. We're free to do that because it's just normal DNSSEC. We'll just put DS records in. So in my example, which is likely to come very true, it's actually true at this instant, there's a DLV namespace at dlv.isc.org, and there's a DNS key at vix.com. You can search for it. I think I may have lost the private part of that key, but that's all right, it doesn't matter. It's easy enough to make a new key pair and sign your zone with the new key, so losing a private key isn't important as long as no one else gets a hold of it. And there is indeed no DS record for vix.com in the com zone. And so the DLV capable validator that will be in bind 9.4 sometime this summer, I hope, is going to be looking at vix.com.dlv.isc.org for a DLV record. And if it finds it and it's able to verify that using the trust anchor that it will have pre-configured, then anyone who participates in this weird scheme will be able to verify signed answers that they get from me, even though com, for various reasons, is not able to help them. Now, there's an 800-pound gorilla in almost any field who gets to sit wherever they want to. And in the DNS field, that gorilla's name is MIL. Some of our funding comes from there, but more than that, they are an early adopter of this type of technology, and making them happy is a good way to showcase whatever it is you're trying to do next. So rather than making a DNS key pair for MIL and sending their public key to us for insertion into our DLV namespace, they kind of insisted that they would run their own DLV namespace. As a result, the validator can be configured with multiple namespaces, and lookups are a two-step process. First, you take the best matching namespace, and then within that namespace, you look for the record. Clearly, VeriSign could try to do the same thing with COM. I'm not convinced that they have the same trust and acceptance in the world's validator community that MIL would have or that we will have for the root zone. I'm not going to go deeply into this unless it comes up in Q&A. Okay, so what about all these extra queries? Because right now there are no DNSSEC metadata records anywhere in the system. So clearly, if you take a validator and turn on DLV, then it's never going to find. Every single validation attempt will fail. And that sounds like a recipe for disaster if every time it fails, it's going to go do a lookup in the DLV namespace. So this part is, once again, a little bit tricky, and I have Sam Wheeler from Sparta to thank for coming up with this idea. The NSEC record that I described earlier is not intended to be used for negative caching. So let's say that you are a caching server and your address is getting handed out with DHCP leases. People are sending you queries, and you have an NSEC whose span matches, covers the name somebody just asked you. You'd like to be able to think you could send them that NSEC and say, here take this and go away, but you can't. The rules in the protocol are that you can only send someone an NSEC in response to a query if the query they're sending you is the same one that caused you to cache that NSEC in the first place. And so that would be on-the-wire aggressive negative caching, and that is prohibited. However, there is no prohibition against DNS applications, like let's say it's the INN newsreader or news server, net news server, or maybe it's your web browser. If it's maintaining its own cache, which they mostly all do these days, and it has cached that NSEC record, and it is about to make another query, and that query is covered by some NSEC that it has already heard, then you are perfectly within your rights to suppress the query for the name that's covered by that NSEC. So although a DNS server cannot participate in this because that would be on-the-wire aggressive negative caching, any DNS application can suppress queries using what we call off-the-wire aggressive negative caching. And through a marvelous bit of label engineering, it turns out that the DLV component of your validator is a DNS application. That means we suppress most of the queries that would result from turning on DLV. Once you've learned that there are no DS or no names in a certain part of the tree, you don't have to ask about that again. There's an example on the slide. I won't read it. And again, I'll credit Sam Wheeler from Sparta with coming up with that idea. It takes someone with a twisted, sort of crypto-capable mind to come up with this type of a hack. Drugs alone won't help you. So there are some new roles created in the community. In order to make this roll out, we need a registry. That'll be us, Internet Systems Consortium. We run a root name server. We know how to do this type of stuff. And our job will be to accept keys from domain holders. I've heard from some registrars that they would like to be able to send us keys so that they can somehow charge more for this. I will probably find a way to make that happen, although I'm hoping that we will not charge for it because, once again, this must not look as though we are trying to create an empire or a revenue stream or anything like that. We're a nonprofit public benefit corporation. That makes us, legally speaking, we are a ward of the state, and we have to act according to the public interest, but interpretation of that is kind of loose. I like to stay on the conservative side of that interpretation. Registrant, that's you guys. If you are interested in using secure DNS, you've made your key and your registrar has said, I'm sorry, I can't take that DS record from you because I wouldn't have anything to do with it anyway. There's no field for that on the registration page, etc. Then you could send it to us. And we'll go through a certain amount of haranguing to make sure that you really are the owner of that domain and not trying to sort of learn how to pretend to be someone else. Then there are validator operators. That's all the people whose caching resolvers want to be able to use this mechanism to validate data. They have to fetch some keying information from us and ideally join a mailing list where we would inform them that, gee, we're about to change that keying information. I don't think that we're going to be able to update the true root key ever, but I think that for a limited time and limited size project like this one, it's reasonable to think that, gee, maybe we will want to improve the software and improve the data that people are using. So I'll go through this real briefly. I want secure DNS, and you can agree with me or not about how urgent it is, but I hope you'll agree that DNS with security would be more useful than the DNS we have now. There's no way DNSSEC-bis, as specified by the IETF, is going to work outside the test lab. They would only accept engineering considerations when they were doing the design, and telling them, yeah, but what about ICANN and what about VeriSign and DOC? They just said, hey, that's not a technical consideration. We're going to design something that's solid technically. Well, maybe they did, but it doesn't mean that it's going to work. There's this whole thing about the real world as well. The IETF has kind of turned into an ivory tower over the years. And I say that having been an active participant through those years. We want DLV to get it out of the lab, but we don't want DLV to replace to take pressure off of the root zone or the COM zone or anyone else to get themselves secured. Because the way the IETF designed it is the only way it'll scale to the size of the internet. And if we don't kill this when its time is over, then we run the risk of having good enough be the enemy of the best. Again, the IETF does not endorse this technology at all, nor have they condemned it. It fits in as a local policy exception. This is just a cooperative way for validator operators and domain holders to exchange keys without a mailing list. My company, ISC, is committed to this. We're going to run a registry. We're going to put support in bind 9.4. We're going to publish enough specification information so that non-bind implementations can also work fine with this. I'm going to keep coming to places like this, hopefully with larger audiences, although you've been great, and telling them how wonderful this will be if only they would support it. I see a couple of questions, but since this is my last slide, I'll just get to the end. And last but not least, we promise to kill DLV when it's time, which is something that probably no commercial entity would be able to promise to do. So, question here?
Yeah, you could suspend disbelief in reality for a moment and pretend that you could snap your fingers and cause the ownership of the root zone to be somehow resolved, and you can get the root zone signed. Create the key. You wouldn't need DLV, but what other barriers would there be to a widespread DNSSEC deployment at that point? I realize those are two huge ifs. That's why I say just suspend disbelief.
Sure. Okay.
Solve those two problems.
So I,
Key rollover. You also solve key rollover, right? With magic.
okay. So assuming that the miracles that this design is predicated on were to occur, really at that point it's just sort of the standard release the tarball and a lot of README files and how-to files and websites doing the blow-by-blow. Now, in your question, you said, what if the root zone were signed, and what if key rollover were fixed, and so forth. Root by itself won't do. We also need COM to be signed.
Presumably, once you've got a trust anchor in root.
Well, let me go through the economics for you again. VeriSign has 13 copies of the COM cluster all around the world, and they pay a lot of money. They've got, database mirroring. They've got diverse gigabit transit. They've got a lot invested in those. And we're asking them to at least triple their hardware, which just means to pay the rest of the depreciation on what they have now and do a forklift replacement and a new capital investment. And the total revenue that they can expect the first day that they sign .com is nothing, because there are no signed zones. And they don't even know if they're going to be allowed by their contract with ICANN to charge more for this. So it may be that there's never any additional revenue. But there certainly won't be any at the time that they make their capital investment. So I believe that signing the root will not increase VeriSign's likelihood of deployment at all. However, if you add that to the list of miracles, you say that root gets signed.
Say that somebody like DHS writes a check for that and say, well, okay, if you're going to triple up your hardware, it's going to cost X dollars, here's X dollars, go buy the stuff.
Okay, if you can deliver on those miracles, then you can have DNSSEC without DLV starting next month. In other words, we have to get 9.4 out the door.
I want to ask you about it, and then we'll Western Border.
Okay, well, let's go back and forth.
Yeah, it seems like this tripling the servers thing's a red herring. It assumes that one day everyone's going to submit keys. Why not just have the fast path be what is existing there? Machines don't have any special key material. And then if you receive a request for a domain that has key material, it just gets shunted off to a second body of servers. In presuming you're only going to have, for the first year, ideally, maybe 1% of the servers out there go ahead, actually upgrade and put in key material. You know what? I can come up with a mini cluster that handles that 1%. That's special.
Or you could dump it to the DLV, the 1% of the queries that.
Okay.
It's irrational that you have to go from the existing layout to we're tripling our servers when you can just take the special case and move it to a different body of servers.
The problem is the NSEC records. Since they describe periods of non-existence in the namespace, you have to be able to return them on day one, or you're not compliant with the protocol. And you're returning them whenever someone sets the, gee, I understand DNSSEC, send me that metadata bit, which will be set by default in all validators, because they're opportunistic about wanting to get this data.
But you should be able to say from this name all the way through this name, there is nothing. And that can be pre-cached. And if it's a sparse namespace, then you just have NSEC records that are pre-calculated that are just massive. I mean, you will have, you have a bandwidth spike, but that still requires, what percentage of clients will actually be requesting this DNSSEC data?
Everything from bind 9.3 going forward requests this data. So
it will definitely be a bandwidth hit, but it doesn't seem to be a large storage hit, not until the namespace stops being so sparse.
Well, there's one NSEC per existing name, so there's 50 million of them, and they have accompanying RR-SIGs, and both of them have long strings of random and crypto random data associated with them. So unless you have enough hardware to generate that stuff on the fly, which we don't think anyone will, even with hardware crypto boards and whatnot, it turns out the minimum cost of entry is a much larger footprint. Now, VeriSign is in a good position because they abandoned bind for COM a couple of years ago. And I'm not saying bind was unsuitable. I like bind just fine. After all, we publish it. But because VeriSign is a non-bind shop, I mean, they use bind for root, but since COM doesn't depend on bind, and they have the team that wrote their software, it's called Atlas, they should be in a pretty good position to put in some optimizations like what you're describing. And so I have indeed likened their whining to that of a stuck pig, and that they really need to just shut up and do the work. But they're not a public benefit corporation, and if what's really going on is that there's no new revenue and they just don't feel like budging until there is, they can use this as a smokescreen all day long and no one can stop them except me with something like DLV that causes their customers to gain affinity to someone who isn't them. In other words, I think I can stop them with fear rather than with greed. Now, I want to go a little further, and I will say some of the people that are working at VeriSign are, are at the top of the field. Easily peers of the realm. I'm happy that they run a root name server because their people are good. So don't take me as a VeriSign basher, even though they named me as a co-conspirator in their lawsuit against ICANN. They wanted something called opt-in, which sounds like it's related to spam, but it isn't. It was a very minor, very simple, straightforward protocol change that meant that you didn't need to describe those periods of non-existence among the namespace except between zones that were signed. So if you didn't have DS records, there would be no NSEC records. So you could actually have unsigned children that did not cost you anything in the parent, and that would have meant that their deployment cost on day one would have been delta zero. They asked for this. I said, gee, sounds like a really good idea because it'll get them on our side. It'll get, it'll cause deployment to occur earlier. And only the people who do have key data will cost them more memory, so it'll fit their existing depreciation schedule. Hey guys, let's give it to them. But it turned out that they'd kind of poisoned the well by that time. And for reasons not technical at all, they ended up not getting what they wanted. I believe that if we had given it to them, they would already be signed, like .nl and .se. There's a new thing coming out called NSEC-3 that solves the zone walking problem so that you can't discover someone's zone against their will. There is a provision in NSEC-3 to reintroduce opt-in technology, and it may be that this time it will sail through and VeriSign will implement that, and the current DNSSEC technology that's based on NSEC will end up never really seeing the light of day. All of these things could yet come to pass. Question here?
Yeah, this is perhaps a more politically motivated question, but if there were, say, more DNS cache poisoning attacks similar to the one that happened 3 or 4 months ago, would that help in some way resolve the political problems between Department of Commerce and VeriSign, et cetera?
Well, the question is, if there were more DNS cache poisoning attacks like the ones that hit the papers a few months ago, could that break the logjam? And I don't know. Right, most phishing attacks, and phishing is a huge problem. If you haven't been studying the numbers, I recommend you do so. Phishing attacks don't usually depend on DNS poisoning. Yes, it's true you could maybe do a pretty effective attack that way, but there's lower hanging fruit, so there's not much benefit there. Now, I've been given some thought as I roll out DLV to declaring that secure DNS will help prevent phishing attacks, just to try and get the audience a little more interested, even though it's really kind of a theoretical thing. It's not happening in the field right now.
What's clearly happening though is the evolution of phishing for farming. That is DNS.
Yes.
Why send 800,000 spam messages saying, you're a Bank of America customer, come to Bank of America site, which is my phishing site. Why not just poison the DNS of a big ISP, saying anytime you want to resolve DOA.com, it's right here.
You would think that they'd be using this more than they do, but the data I'm seeing says that they have other better ways to do it. Once we close off those other holes, guarantee this will become the low-hanging fruit and it will be widely used. And once that happens, I think the Department of Commerce will feel a lot of heat, both from its normal constituency, who frankly is the Fortune 500, and also from Homeland Security, who has, a very public mandate to solve problems like this. And so you could see some movement. And the way, if any of you has the power to do this, the way to help move the pressure to where it could do some good would be to make the existing phishing attacks less successful. Start closing the holes people are using now. I had a question over here.
Question is, where you talked about .NET would have their own DLV.
Yeah.
Is this an area where there's going to be a lot of different domains that are going to want their own rather than just
The question is, if .mil decides they want their own DLV namespace, isn't that going to start a bit of a land rush and have a whole bunch of these people who tie their domain name, either they tie it to their revenue stream or to their national autonomy and sovereignty? Aren't they all going to say, yes, I want that too? Well, yes and no, right? The thing I tried to explain to the .mil people is you don't need to do this. If you believe you can get a validator population to cut and paste some data from you into their config files, and believe me, they can because they control their entire validator population, right? Then why not just have them put your key into their config file? Why would you go through all the harassment of DLV? Just put the .mil public key in there as an anchor. You don't need you don't need anything. And that would be the argument I would make for .com, who would care about this, or .nl, .se, etc. Sometimes what this comes down to is sort of who's the alpha male, whose equipment is longest. And I think there will be some people who irrationally will choose to start their own DLVs. I don't think they will reach the global validator population the way that I will reach it. People have come over the years to trust ISC, and when they download bind, if they see something in the README that says, here's something you could do, they might do it. If they then get spammed by VeriSign saying, here's something you could do for .com, well, maybe they won't do it.
Is there anybody else that's making DNS servers that you think ought to support these extensions? You mentioned Atlas. Of course, Bind supports them now. Any other players that are significant?
The question is, what are the other players that support this technology or that should? Now, DLV has no server-side component. Okay, so for the secure DNS technology, Nominum has it. So this company, nominum.com, and disclaimer, I was a founder there and I hold some shares. They sell something that does kind of what Bind does, but very different configurations. They have appliances and so forth. And they've been tracking this stuff right along, and it works fine. Also, NSD, which comes from NLNet Labs, has full support for DNSSEC. The other ones, I know Dan Bernstein has a DNS package, but he thinks that this approach to secure DNS is foolish, and he has promised not to put it in. There are some other ones out there like Power DNS and so forth that probably not, you're not going to see this technology there until after it has made a lot of headway elsewhere. But in my opinion, there's enough diversity of server implementation out there that we can be pretty sure that the standard is interoperable, because there are multiple implementations that share no code with each other that work well with each other. So I know in the early version of DNS, they wrote a spec and then they wrote a bunch of code in Pascal on TOPS 20, and the spec was wrong, or maybe the code was wrong. They didn't agree, but in fact, conforming to the spec would not have helped you, right? The only way you could possibly get your software to work was to test it against the TOPS 20 code base. And Bind had some similar effects early on, but we're not going to see that effect this time. DNS resolvers, there's really only one validator right now, and that's ours. I know that...
so how does something like IE or Netscape or something like that?
Well, Netscape descends from ours. They just import our validator, our resolver code, which once our resolver has validation in it, then that'll just appear in the Netscape portable runtime. For something like Microsoft, I think they're going to work on their own because they do all their own stuff in C++ now. I don't know how far along they are. And the only other validator of which I'm aware is in Perl. It's part of the NetDNS package, and it's slow, but it's pretty good. It's probably more readable than ours, but it's you couldn't embed that in MSIE or anything like that. Now, it's not a given that every client needs to be doing DNS validation. It may be that some will, but it may also be that they'll just say, look, I trust the network between me and my recursive name server, right? But DHCP told me to use it. It's on the same LAN as me. I don't think that we could be man-in-the-middle attacked. I just don't see the firewall letting that happen. So I'm just going to ask him, because I know, as a matter of record, as a matter of company policy, that he's going to do full validation, and he won't give anything to me that didn't pass validation for him. So it's hard to say exactly what the deployment characteristics will be. And one of the reasons for that is that there's currently no client or application anywhere that will work differently or work better in the presence of DNSSEC metadata, right? You'd like to do that. You'd like to start seeing, yes, an SSL could start up without the X509 part if there was a secure DNS there. Nobody's doing that work.
I can see a browser someday saying, well, it says you're at DOA.com, you're not.
I would like to see that too, although SSL is not just about authenticating the other end. It's used for the session crypto. So it's not just authenticity, it's information hiding. And so they would have to figure out some Diffie-Hellman random number exchange thing to go do there, and I don't know if there's will for that. Questions over here? How are we on time? No. More questions?
One more, I suppose. I'm used to writing software such that it's as scalable and fast as it possibly be. You mentioned that you wrote DLV such that you built in some things that would hinder its scalability. Other than the Easter egg, what type of things were those?
It's not an Easter egg. It is the aggressive negative caching. If you talk to the math boys and say, okay, if the size of the deployed base was, had this many zeros in it, how many queries would be suppressed, what percentage? And it turns out that percentage is not fixed, and that at somewhere in between 1 and 2 million domains, aggressive negative caching stops helping you very much. So it's like valve float in a car. Yeah.
You mentioned before that there are protocol issues with increasing the number of root servers. You said just a minute ago that there's essentially one resolver on the planet, yours. And you also mentioned that we're going to need to combine 9 cores on the DLV and so on. So, in reality, what is the thing stopping us from changing the protocol to increase the number of root servers?
Question is, there's a protocol limitation, 13 root name servers, but there's such a small set of implementations, and we're about to pretty much replace a lot of them in order to get this DNS security. Couldn't we fix the protocol to allow more? One froot server in Palo Alto, there are now 31 of them. I know that in New Zealand, as an example, they used to have 2 OC3s leaving the island, and there were days when both of them would be down, and you could not reach other websites or other places in New Zealand because you couldn't be told by some distant server that there was a server for .nz that was very close. And we fixed that. There's an froot in Sky Tower now. And we fixed that in Johannesburg, we fixed that in Rome, we fixed that everywhere that we can possibly find a sponsor.
It's okay to stay here because we're going to have to take down the mics and the projectors.
Uh-huh. Time's up. Thank you for coming.